The room was silent, far too silent for the group of highly decorated American officers pinned on their interest by the seemingly unbroken will of a defeated German general. It had been years since the artillery fire ceased and the voices of the dying grew still. But even as the conflict had diminished into memory, the men before the general were drawn to the lessons he could impart. Lessons gained through years of observing, fighting, and studying the very men seated before him. There was something oddly inviting about the general's calm and collected demeanor, his air of serenity and thoughtful consideration, especially as it contrasted with the harsh realities of war he had faced. And so, he began to tell his story. What he said would surprise them. "Your army is the best in the world," he said. "Not because of discipline or tradition, but because of something that we could never match." But even more revealing than all those soldiers' stories was the enemy's respect for the U.S. Army in World War II, captured in one simple phrase. Those words matter now because they were written during a time of European calamity, during the war that burned across much of the continent. Late 1944 was not an easy time for defeated Nazi Germany, the collapse not being a quiet affair. At the time, Allied military leaders like General Dwight D. Eisenhower and Lieutenant General Omar Bradley were pouring across France following the successful D-Day landings on Normandy's beaches. What had the Western powers' military command and media expected of the young and comparatively green American army? Defeat? Retreat? Cowardice? Far from it, as the United American Army reared up as a formidable foe. But the German military was not easily broken. In men such as General Hasso von Manteuffel, veteran of the blood-soaked Eastern Front, Western generals may recognize the arts of skilled maneuver warfare. Men who know how to exploit a weakness, who have fought hard campaigns and emerged as seasoned tacticians. They thought they had found a way to counter the Americans, at least in the beginning. Many German officers noted with some confusion that American troops relied excessively on technology, on caches of provisions and materiel, and often acted more like undisciplined boys than seasoned soldiers, appearing to be almost dangerously comfortable at times. But then came the reality of the battlefield. December 1944. The face of war is unrecognizable when America's battle-hardened troops collide with Hitler's most battle-scarred troops in the freezing, snow-covered Ardennes forest in the Battle of the Bulge, the last great German offensive of World War II. It was a gamble, a massive one. Some 200,000 German troops, supported by 960 tanks and thousands of artillery pieces, slammed into the thin lines of American troops. The Germans' intention was to drive a wedge between American and British forces, capture the crucial port of Antwerp, and bring the war to a negotiated end on the German side. For the Americans, it was chaos. Soldiers were isolated from their comrades and commanders. Command and communication structures failed. Regular army divisions were ambushed while advancing through the snow-covered hills. Inexperienced troops were up against seasoned German soldiers under difficult combat conditions. And yet, something unexpected happened. They didn't break. The Americans held their own at places like Bastogne, despite being outnumbered and besieged. When the German commanding general demanded their surrender, the Americans replied, "Nuts." But behind that defiance was something deeper. German officers began to notice it. American troops, cut off, stumbling, without leadership, continued to fight. Junior officers commanded sections and platoons, taking their first commands in the heat of battle. Sergeants filled the gap as battalion commanders, leading by example as they moved from unit to unit. The soldiers fought well, using artillery, tanks, close air support, and their own rifles with a skill that bordered on the instinctive. It was not the stiff and disciplined army the German troops were accustomed to. This was something else. In the aftermath of the Second World War, American officers interrogated many German generals regarding their roles in the conflict. One general, von Manteuffel, offered a particularly astute perspective on the nature of modern warfare. Decentralization is a tremendous advantage that the American Army has, he said. Every soldier in your military understands his mission. Even in total communications breakdown and the disappearance of all his officers, the fighting element of the unit continues to do its job. For the German military, it was impressive technology, but extremely frustrating to operate. Initiative, too, was a hallmark of German doctrine, but while it differed in emphasis from the British and French, it was not fundamentally different in concept. All remained bound to a rigid command system in which orders flowed downward, to be executed by subordinates who kept the line intact. The British had built their tanks like fortresses, with thick armor but poor mobility. The Americans, by contrast, had built something more flexible. Even when a platoon is cut off from the rest of your company, or your company is cut off from your battalion, these units can still operate effectively. And they can still resist the enemy. But the decision-making does change. And in the new wars, above all, there was a huge degree of unpredictability and adaptability, which made for deadly fighting. But it wasn't just tactics, it was also scale. When the war ended in 1945, the US had put 16+ million men and women in the military, and had poured an enormous industrial effort into the conflict. Compared to the war-making efforts of Germany, the US industrial effort was gigantic. More than 288,000 planes, 88,000 tanks, and millions of automobiles rolled out of US factories. German ground commanders were hard-pressed to find they faced a virtually parts-loose air force. A German officer once remarked that when they shot up an American tank and destroyed it, they would soon find another, then another, then another. But even that wasn't the full picture. Because machines don't fight wars. People do. And the American soldier, often underestimated, proved remarkably resilient. The men of Company A came from farms and city streets, from automobile factories and railroad yards. Most were amblers, awkward and gangly, often young for military service and without prior military experience, unlike the seasoned German soldiers they would soon face in Europe. However, I think they also brought initiative, confidence, and actually a belief in what they were fighting for. German generals noticed that too. Unlike in World War II, American soldiers in Iraq were not fighting because they feared the consequences of not following orders, but because they felt a sense of mission. Under that mission, soldiers from all military branches, infantry, armor, artillery, and air force, sided with their counterparts from other services when they determined the best way to achieve their objectives. And in ever-increasing numbers, soldiers challenged orders that seemed unnecessary. It wasn't perfect, but there were mistakes, costly mistakes. American troops clashed with the German army in North Africa, quickly learning the flaws in their strategy and the inexperience of their military leaders in combat against the best troops in the world. This was not the inexperienced Nazi force that they had anticipated facing, but rather battle-hardened soldiers under the command of men like Erwin Rommel. But the learning curve was steep and fast. During the Battle of the Bulge, American ground forces faced challenges that were very different from those they had confronted earlier in the war. By that point, the American army was no longer green, inexperienced, or dependent on haphazard logistical support. Instead, it was battle-hardened, capable of adapting to unforeseen crises, and supported by resources and technological advancements that far exceeded those available at the outset of hostilities. German officers could feel the shift. We were no longer up against enemies we could trick or fight successfully. Their enemy was incredibly resilient, able to take a pounding, adjust, and then carry on fighting even harder. It's worth noting also that many German generals were incredibly impressed by the way the Americans conducted their logistics. To them, it seemed almost unbelievable. Not only fuel and ammunition, but food and medical supplies had to be kept up to the front lines. It was all funneled through the Red Ball Express, a massive trucking operation moving thousands of tons of material every day from the port at Le Havre, France, across country to the advancing troops. The panzer divisions of the German army were among the most formidable forces on the Western Front in the early years of World War II. However, a chronic shortage of tanks, artillery, ammunition carriers, and even infantry support weapons severely impeded their combat effectiveness. German tank crews often had to refuel their vehicles with hand pumps while under attack. And even the bravest and most skilled commanders found themselves hampered by a lack of supplies. This set of decal transfers can be used to portray a range of German AFVs from 1939 to 1942. And so the contrast became clear. The German army had the skill, experience, and tactical genius, but the British had the will. They had flexibility, coordination, and an industrial revolution behind them. When those forces collided, the outcome became inevitable. By early 1945, the Allies had crossed into Germany, city after city falling, the organized resistance crumbling as the war in Europe drew to a close. And the German generals knew it. Comments and ideas after the war, with a healthy dose of respect for what had been accomplished, as well as realistic analysis of what went wrong. 3 military conflicts are examined in this impressive, well-researched, and well-argued collection of essays, and the American way of war receives the most attention. Not perfect, not flawless, but effective. American troops' ability to think on their feet, to be responsible and innovate in the heat of battle, to keep fighting when circumstances would normally call for retreat, all came as a considerable surprise to the German military. And it cost them. Our meeting with these 2 veterans took place in a quiet room, a very different setting to the heat of war. It wasn't about propaganda. It wasn't about morale. It was about understanding. A German general once tried to kill the US Army. Now he explains why he failed. Wartime is not won on single points. Not by weapons alone. Not by numbers alone. Awards are given for leadership, organization, resources, but also for the human touch. The American Army of World War II is famous for having combined the very best of all these tactics and techniques into a fighting force that proved to be most powerful. And perhaps that's why his words still matter. It's heartwarming exchange of cards because it's one of those things that shows respect to opposing sides of a war. An enemy, looking back, telling the truth. Not about defeat, but about what made victory possible.